welcome to Special Conversations. I'm Laura Sims, the moderator for this lecture series in the library. And it's great to see everybody. And I'm so pleased to have Nicole Rudick here tonight. And Nicole and I actually met years ago at a Paris review party in the city.
I didn't know that.
Yes. Which sounds so glamorous, doesn't it? The Paris Review party. Well, she was editor of Paris Review. You were managing editor, but then you were also acting editor, right? Interim editor. So we met years ago, and I think you were already living here, but I had never heard of South Orange by that point, and I don't think.
Were you still in?
I was still in Brooklyn. And so now we're here in South Orange together, and we're in the same writers group, and it's really cool. And I'm so excited to be here to talk about her amazing new book, What Is Now Known Was Once Only Imagined, which is an I don't know how to do the parentheses, autobiography of Niki de Saint Phalle. Is that how you pronounce it? Okay. And it's really a fascinating look at the artist's life and work. It's beautiful. It's from Siglio Press. I don't know if you all know Siglio, but they do gorgeous like art and text books. So this one is no different. It's beautiful, and Nicole has these amazing, brilliant essays that bookend the book. So we'll talk about the ways in which this is an innovative biography and autobiography. But first, I just want to tell you a little bit about Nicole. She's the author of What Is Now Known Was Once Only Imagined. I have to say that title many times. And the editor of a new edition of Gary Panter's legendary comic, Jimbo, Adventures in Paradise from New York Review Comics. Her writing on art, literature, and comics has been published in the New York Review of Books, T Magazine, the New York Times, the New Yorker, and elsewhere. She was managing editor of the Paris Review for nearly a decade. So please join me in welcoming. So, were you going to read a little bit and maybe tell us a little bit about the artist before we start?
Yeah.
Is that okay?
Yeah,
Okay.
I'll read just a little bit from my preface and then one of her letters. So the book has a preface and a forward and an afterword by me, and then everything in between is all written by Niki de Saint Phalle, drawn by Niki de Saint Phalle. So I think this will give a little bit of background about the form. In writing the life of Niki de Saint Phalle, I imagined combing her papers and then setting out to speak with those who knew her best in order to form a rounded sense of my subject. At her archive in Southern California, where she spent the last 8 years of her life, I discovered that some of the work had already been done. I paged through a binder full of interviews with her friends, collaborators, assistants, contemporaries, and other categories of people who had cause to know her. The interviews were conducted after Saint Phalle's death, and are intended to be records of both the better known and the more intimate moments of her life. What comes to mind when you hear the name Niki? Each interview subject is asked. Do you remember your first encounter with her? Tell me about your memory of. I thought about that phrasing for some time. Tell me about a memory of a memory. Each interview contains a different Niki. Each interview subject recalls her in a different way. I was suspicious and felt that too often these remembrances sought to lay claim to Saint Phalle. Which of these memories is closer to the truth? What is the truth of a person anyway? I do know that there are numerous memories in this binder, but none are Saint Phalle's. We are all a product of someone else's dream, Hilton Alice observes, writing in the voice of the silent film star Louise Brooks. It's an argument for liberating ourselves from what others may think of us, or more precisely, from what we imagine they think of us, for heeding the interior monologue, for finding clarity in recognizing the unknown. As a prospective biographer, I also took it as an argument for listening intently to the individual who dreams her own dream. Ruth Skerr set out to write a biography of the 17th century biographer John Aubrey, but found only fragments of memoiristic material. When I was searching for a biographical form that would suit the remnants of his life, Skur writes, I realized that he would all but vanish inside a conventional biography, crowded out by his friends, acquaintances, and their multitudinous interests. She constructed her biography as a diary, composed only of Aubrey's own words, gleaned from manuscripts, letters, and books. Where she could not fill gaps with his writings, she let the emptiness stand. When he is silent, she explains, I do not speculate about where he was or what he was doing or thinking. That is a neglected truth, the unknowability of another's mind. I took Skur's lesson to heart, as well as her directive that the biographer's aim should be, quote, to get as close to her subject and his sensibility as possible, to produce a portrait that captures at least something of what that person was like, end quote. What could be closer to the artist's voice than the artist's own voice, closer to her sensibility than that produced by her own hand? Saint Phalle left behind 2 memoirs of her early life, and a vast trove of drawings, prints, writings, letters, poems, books, and sketches that respond to or comment upon her life and thoughts. An artwork for Saint Phalle was not an object, but an act, ritual, performance, public, revelatory of her personal life. Art gave her wholeness. It gave her the ability to talk about loss and pain, mistakes and successes, collaboration and creativity. It gave her the ability to talk about joy. Quote, I bring to life my desires, my feelings, my contradictions, longing, forgotten memories, shadows, visions from some other place, she writes on a sketch. The duality of this statement, of bringing to life, is an apt summation of the overlap of Saint Phalle's life and art, both a bringing into existence and a bringing to bear. These are visions from the frontiers of consciousness. In living, she gave these sensations form. In her art, she gave them life. In her archive, I paged through a scrapbook containing newspaper clippings and exhibition announcements put together by the artist Jean Tinguely, Saint Phalle's collaborator, supporter, confidant, and lover. On one page, a wallet-sized black and white photograph of Saint Phalle is pinned between the book's spiral binding and a pink program from the Festival of New Realism at Gallery Murator, Nice in 1961. Her hair looks newly shorn in a cropped page boy that perhaps grew out to the unruly bob she sports in many of the photographs of her earliest shooting paintings begun that same year. She is youthful and unadorned. It could be a passport photo, but in any case, it shows her at the start of her long career. Tinguely has drawn lines in blue marker radiating out from the photo like vivid starlight. She shines brightest on the page because she's the only star in the sky. So the letter is, in 1990, it was 94, she wrote a series of letters for a German exhibition catalog they're all posthumous, so they were all sort of retroactive, looking back on her life. So this was written in the 90s, but it's talking about an event that happened in the mid-1970s, when she had a pulmonary embolism and went to Arizona to get better, and then went to St. Moritz in Switzerland. And it's, well, I'll read it and then maybe I'll explain it. So it's written to, it's in the form of a letter, but it was a letter that was never sent and never intended to be sent.
And there are a lot of those.
There are several, yeah. This one is to her friend Marina Corella, who's a Greek artist. Dear Marina, during these years in St. Moritz, I fell in love with a glacier. I cannot remember the name of it anymore, but I remember exactly what it looked like. Maybe you remember, there are many glaciers in Switzerland, and this particular one struck my fancy. It took about an hour's walk to get to it. I must have walked there 100 times. Then I wrote a film script about it. The subject was an artist and his preoccupation with time, accelerated time, metaphysical time, the merging of times. In the end, the artist walks onto the glacier, knowing his youth there will be both captured and eternal. I became fascinated with the idea of committing the perfect suicide, the way someone in an Agatha Christie novel would feel fascinated by committing the perfect crime. I would prepare a picnic, I went for days fantasizing about what would be my last meal. I would take great care to wear lots of very warm clothing, makeup, have my hair done in the afternoon, bring a very pretty blanket, a flashlight, the Duino elegies, and no one would ever know. My plans had to be diabolically clever. Otherwise, Ava or Jean or you might guess I feel awful. It must be beautiful, work of art. So into my pocket, I would slip in just a few sleeping pills. The glacier would do the rest. I would be found fast asleep and frozen in the morning, and I would look beautiful in the morning when they found me. My plan was to go out to the glacier around midnight, have a last meal. I had finally decided on caviar and Dom Perignon. Pop the sleeping pills in my mouth, read with the help of my flashlight the fourth elegy, and join the stars. Those that loved me, knowing how crazy I was about the glacier, would think Niki had gone there for a midnight snack and fallen asleep drinking champagne. They wouldn't be surprised. 2 days before the final day, I came down with pneumonia and was taken to hospital in Bern. You came to see me. I couldn't talk for 3 days. I was so depressed. My search for infinity brought me to the edge of the precipice. Living alone high in the Engadine Mountains, I spent my time reading Nietzsche and Bachelor. There was no reason to live alone. I chose this Spartan existence, which went against my rather accessible, open, and gay nature, and I started to burn like a fire. My solitude gave me an ecstatic drunkenness. Passion was more than existence. Like the phoenix that needs to go through the destructive fire with his body to be reborn, so I tormented myself with my will to go to the end of the experience. Not only my mind, but my body took fire. Only through suffering and sacrifice did I feel free. I wanted to fly like a bird and discover infinity. I have always chosen moments of great intensity instead of durability. My art, as my love, will be sacrificed on the infernal burning altar. Remember? Your hair turned into snakes.
Wow.
The reason I picked it is because it sort of does lots of things at once. So she really was suicidal in her life, and she did try to kill herself earlier. But she's also, she's talking about getting her hair done and having her makeup done, and you see that throughout the book where she's concerned with these different things, that she's, I don't know that she didn't think of herself explicitly as being feminist, but she wanted to be independent, but she also wanted to look good.
Right.
And she was going to have it all.
Right.
Wow.
And does that image go with the letter?
It does,
Did you
yeah.
show that?
Sort of,
Yeah.
and then the drawing that follows it is one where it's, and there are lots of these sort of dueling images, and a lot of them are in the book are drawings in text. And so on the one side it says, I'm angry, I'm afraid, I'm cold, I'm driven, I'm cruel, I'm bad. And on the other it says, I'm a star, I am a child, I am a worshiper, and that sort of thing. So there was always this push and pull, which I think you get in the letter too. And the cover image is the same.
Yeah.
Sort of
And I was
the
looking
bad
at that,
stuff on the one and the good stuff on the other.
at this first image too in the book. There aren't words, right? But
Yeah.
duality there.
So that was sort of the thread in the book, was this
Push and pull. Yeah, yeah. And how did you first come across her work and become interested in her?
I discovered her at some point when I was, I don't know, a kid, maybe in high school. I don't
Yeah.
quite remember, but she was French, and I loved French
Yeah.
stuff.
And don't you say in the book, like, because she had your name
It was,
too?
yeah, my nickname.
That's cool.
My best friend calls me Niki.
Uh-huh.
So it was, her work was very colorful, and it was about women. I think I probably saw Bananas, which were these buoyant, colorful women. And that was it. I mean, she was in the back of my mind for 20, 25 years or whatever before I decided to write the book.
Yeah. How did the book come about?
It was probably around 2016, I think. And I, by that time had I guess a good sense of the quality of the work in the sense that it was very autobiographical, explicitly autobiographical, and that it involved writing and images often together. And I knew Lisa Pearson, who runs Siglio, and I knew that this was exactly her kind of book, and so we met for lunch and I pitched it, and I think I said like 2 sentences and she's like, yes.
That's great.
So it's very easy.
That's a great experience. It's very rare, right?
And then it was just a matter of getting out to California and getting to her archive, which I did just before the pandemic, so it was the fall before, and spent a week there taking pictures and seeing things, and I found, I think, more than I ever sort of dreamed, stuff that had never been published.
Right.
It was, sort of like, there was only a fax version available, all this sort of weird diaries that nobody had ever seen before.
Right.
And then I spent the pandemic putting it together.
Wow.
Making an edit of it.
Right. Yeah, so that, you talk about it not being a typical biography. I mean, when you set out to write it, did you think it would be more of a typical, like, kind of a rounded portrait the way a lot of biographies are? Or?
I thought that I would go and interview people that had been in her life.
Yeah.
And that I would use her work as the primary, way to make a narrative. But then I would sort of interject these other things to fill it out. And then seeing that binder of interviews, and seeing how people always had, every Niki was different.
Right, everyone has their own
And it's always
versions.
true, like it's true with everybody. You could ask 10 people about yourself and they might all have different impressions.
Right.
So her voice was so strong in the work.
Yeah.
And her hand was so strong in talking about her own life and her own feelings that, as Ruskers says about Aubrey, that I didn't want it to be diluted by other people's comments about her. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I love that, and I love how the work just kind of shines in the middle there. And I was wondering too, so in a book like this, then the selection and arrangement becomes very crucial, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what was that process like? You must have spent a lot of time thinking about, I think somewhere you mentioned, it's not meant to be a narrative, right, the way you've set up the book.
It's not meant to be a traditional.
Right, not traditional, but you do want it should be read in sequence.
It should be read in sequence.
Yeah.
So you read, if there's a drawing and there's text on it, you read the drawing, you read the text.
Yeah.
And it all together, it does tell a story. It does progress through her life.
Right.
And I didn't want anybody else's voice or drawing in there, so that was one sort of limitation I put on myself. And there are certain gaps. Her plays don't really get discussed. So I was sort of really dependent on whatever she had written about or drawn about. But I think the main things are there. And I also limited it to a handful of the people who were sort of loomed largest in her life. So it was her husband, Harry Matthews, the writer, Jean Tanguy, who he was essential in her life, her mother, her father, for better or for worse, and the curator, Pontus Holton, who was a great supporter of her and who gave her many exhibitions. So I sort of found a way to hone it to those people, and I think it holds together.
It does.
And for my afterword, I had originally written, I started to panic a little bit about how it wasn't going to work.
Yeah.
So for my afterword, I made this timeline, this chronology of her life, and it was very factual. Like this happens and this happens, and then I interjected these sort of little interesting quotes and whatever, and I sent it to Lisa, my publisher, and she said, "You're doing exactly what you didn't want to do."
Right.
I was like, "You're so right." I just stripped it out. So whatever was left was what went in there.
Nice.
Yeah.
Wow. So I read in an interview that you said, I love when people quote your words back to you. In life, I've always sat close to the weirdo end of the spectrum. And I'm wondering if you can explain that for us and how it relates to this project.
I don't know if weirdo was probably the word I should have chosen, but,
Your husband's nodding.
weirdo is the right
He likes
word.
it.
Yeah.
I think it's writers and artists who are doing something different than maybe what is the dominant trend at the time. The history of art and the history of literature are always told in these as though there's this timeline. This happened and then that happened. But there's so many other things going on that it's impossible really to give this succinct history. So like an example would be, I wrote about the Bay Area artists in the 50s who were making figurative work at the same time that abstract expressionism was was dominant in the United States and large. And so there were all of these people doing completely other kinds of work.
Right.
That's very important to a whole other group of artists.
Right.
So I think that's partly what I meant.
Yeah.
I also do like weird stuff.
Yeah.
Stuff like, comics that doesn't get a lot of attention, or poetry that doesn't always get the sort of attention that, like, say, in the book review or, the mainstream publications.
Right.
And then writers and artists who are doing something a little unusual.
Yeah.
And so Niki she's in some sense, a really famous artist, but at the same time in the United States especially, people didn't really know who she was, and I think the PS1 show that was...
When was that?
When was that? That was supposed to open right as COVID started, and then
Okay.
it did open after that, but I think it was a revelation.
Yeah.
Even though I think it sort of only scratched the surface.
Yeah.
So it seemed ripe for exploring her work in a way that it hadn't been before. There were numerous catalogs of her work, but they sort of divide them up, according to theme or something like that. And I just was so struck by how explicitly autobiographical her work is, how much she put it in there, like right on the face of it.
Right.
And that no one had really addressed that and tried to tell a story in that way.
Right.
And the strength of her voice, too, it felt, I think that anybody could go and write a traditional biography. It would be fantastic because she had a fascinating life.
Yeah.
But I felt like this book, that her voice needed to be sort of prominent, in this particular way. It felt like a sort of necessary contribution.
Yeah. I think you say in the foreword that she, in making her way in this male-dominated art world, instead of trying to fit in, she went deeper into, being super autobiographical, talking about being a woman. I thought that was really interesting.
And she was untrained, so she didn't have necessarily she didn't have the training to develop in a way that maybe she would have otherwise.
Right.
But she was also looking at these she was very influenced by these visionary, huge projects like Hartwell and, going blank on the name now. The Watts Towers and...
right, because she did sculptural work too. And
yeah, she was looking at these huge, sort of like mini city-like constructions that were the product of one person's, overriding vision. So there was the Facteur Chaval was this French postman who, on his route one day, stumbled over this rock, and it was the most interesting rock he'd ever seen. And I forget, I think it was limestone or something, and there were all of these rocks all over the place in France where he was, and they have a very sculptural look to them. And he spent 20 years, I think, constructing this, it's like a bestiary with towers, and you can go into it. And so those were the sorts of things that she was fascinated by and wanted to do herself. And there was a lot of, once she, she started off with much more, somewhat traditional, but a lot of, getting a lot of anger out.
Yeah.
Or it was also very much just a lot of therapy for her. But then she, I think, had this visionary outlook on life. And that's where her sculpture garden came from. It was the work of her life.
And that came later in her life, right?
It was, she got the land in Italy in '78 and spent 20 years working on it. Finally opened to the public in '98. And I say at the end of the afterward that she never stopped thinking about it, that she was planning a maze,
She was gonna just keep going.
And she died. And
Yeah.
so
That was the end. Yeah.
the tarot garden.
Wow. That's great. So she moved from, images and text. Did she move from that into sculpture?
She was
kept-
doing it the
She was
whole
doing
time.
all of it.
And
Okay.
she says that a lot of her ideas come from drawing. So I think that drawing and writing was always her first way of figuring out what she wanted to do and how she
Right.
felt and what it should look like. So you'll see, if you compare this book to a catalog,
Yeah.
you'll see certain things repeating, the actual images repeating in other kinds of work.
Okay.
So it might be a drawing here that becomes a model that then becomes an actual sculpture or something.
Right.
But also the certain themes just recurred through
Yeah.
her life.
And she also invented a perfume, is that right?
She was asked to help invent a perfume, and she did, and she designed the bottle.
I don't know, that's not part of the campaign, so.
No, the snake looks very similar. She created this bottle, and Warhol threw her it was like a street fair to launch it in Manhattan. And like everybody came, and the sales from the perfume funded the garden.
Oh,
So,
okay.
she didn't have a patron. If she wanted to make it, she had to find the money herself, and so that was part of it.
Okay.
She sold
So she
different
sold-
versions of the perfume and some jewelry, and it funded her projects. So she was her own patron. She
Yeah.
was this woman who, she wanted to do all of it.
Yeah.
She had the vision, and she wasn't going to have it, changed or watered down or anything, informed
Yeah.
by anything else.
Did she have other sources of income at all? Was she?
I think she probably sold work.
Okay, but that,
Um,
she didn't have family money?
Her
or-
family had money, but they had, she had a complicated family history. Without getting into it.
That's for the other biography.
And so she didn't rely on family money.
Yeah.
I mean, she and Harry Matthews got married. They both came from wealthy New York families, and they got married at 19. They eloped partly to escape their families. They both
Yeah.
wanted to get away from it
Right,
and not be the kind of people that their families wanted to be.
Yeah.
Much more bohemian.
right. So speaking of that marriage, I know she writes, there's a big part of the book is kind of about their romance and marriage and motherhood, and I know she, was kind of derided for having left her family for 6 months, right? Wasn't it 6 months?
It turned out to be very, very little time.
Yeah,
But I had never read that it was only 6 months. Whenever
Okay.
you hear about her,
it
it's
sounds like she left.
she left them,
Right.
for years, and there was difficulty and preparing to do, but it was for 6 months.
Right.
And Harry
And he was-
raised the kids and
Yeah.
kept the kids, but they were all in the same city.
Right,
She saw them.
yeah.
They came to her studio.
Okay.
But the things that you hear about her, that's one of the things that everybody seemed to know is, oh,
She left her family.
her family. But she needed to be immersed in art to be able to pursue it.
Mhm.
And Harry understood that,
Mhm.
and he gives her a lot of credit for what she did and for how difficult it would have been.
Mhm.
And she credits him too, or sorry, he credits her for inspiring him to, he'd gone to school to be a composer, a conductor, and she encouraged him to be a poet and to be a writer. So, you know, there was certainly difficulty, but
Right.
the way that women are penalized for wanting to take control of their lives and
Right.
to be as involved in their vocations is so terrible.
Yeah. It goes on.
And the complication of, you know, the complication of being a mother and being, say, a working artist and having that space to oneself.
Right.
It can't be overstated how important
Right.
time and space is.
Yeah. You talk about how the book is kind of a collaboration between you and Niki and the reader. Can you talk about that a little bit? What do you mean by that?
So it's a collaboration between Niki and me because she made the work and she's no longer living. And so it was, you know, it was I who put it together. And so in some sense I feel like, and she didn't intend the works to be put in a book quite in this form. She did write 2 memoirs that that stopped at the point where she left Harry, and then everything after that comes through in her work. So it was in the sense that she made it and I put it together, I felt like we were perhaps collaborating in some sense. And then because there are these gaps, because it's very loose and open, and that I don't spell things out explicitly, that there's room for the reader to come in and to think about it. And this is part of what attracts me to other writers and artists, is there's a certain openness and I guess for lack of a better word, an abstraction to it that is a place for the reader to come in and do their thing, you know, to make connections and to find linkages between things and to think about what it is that you're reading and that you're seeing. And then for me, when I have that experience, it deepens my relationship to the work. And I really feel activated when I read books like that or look at art. So that was the sort of the 3-way relationship.
It's the experience of reading the book, I think. Yeah.
And every time I read it, I see something new in it and some
Yeah.
new connections. So that's also for the readers.
Right.
Like as a reader, I have that experience. too.
Right.
And I love that.
Yeah.
It makes it feel living.
Yeah, exactly.
And not fixed, not
Yeah.
like I have.
Unlike a more formal biography or traditional biography where everything is set and all the blanks are filled in. And I love reading those too, but it's, you know, it's a very different, and like you said, more living, I think, experience reading this book. I have more questions, but does anyone have questions yet for Nicole? Yeah.
What about the work, the target kind of practice work? How long, I forget what she called that body of work, where she was shooting at the canvas with a rifle.
The tear.
How long was she making that work? Was that supposed to, was that also considered performance, or?
It was performance, and it was before performance art, so she was really this proto-performance artist. And she says at some point, I can't remember her exact wording, but that it was less about the work that was created than the act of doing it. So for those who don't know, she made these big canvases and she embedded things like, early on it was bags of paint and sometimes eggs and spaghetti, and then it would be like cans of spray paint, and she would shoot at it with a rifle, like in a gallery, or, you know, sometimes like she went out to California once and did it there, and then they would explode on the canvas and drip, and so whatever form it took was whatever form it took.
And wasn't she always dressed like a job purse or like, you
She
know?
was like, I think one time, but that's the photo that keeps getting reproduced. She was this very beautiful, and she says if I hadn't been beautiful, they would have said I had a complex, and they never would. Right? So, which is probably true. Yeah, I think they said she had a complex anyway, but it started because she saw somebody else's work that had maybe it was, was it John's? I should remember this.
That would be around the same time.
And
right?
then she had this man that she was seeing, and she was angry with him, and she took one of his shirts and put it on a target, and she shot at it. And so it was this, it made her feel
Cathartic.
better. Yeah, it was cathartic. And she says it was cathartic, it made her feel better. And so the tear developed from that, and she was raped by her father when she was a child. She had just a lot of anger about men and about her father and her family, and so the tear part of it was this sort of catharsis, but she also, I think importantly, in these performances, she would give the rifle to other people to shoot, and so that it became a sort of cathartic thing for other people. And then she stopped doing it because she said she felt like a drug addict. That anytime she needed to feel better, she would shoot something. So she's like, I can't do this anymore. I need to do something different. And those are some of her most famous works, but she made so many different kinds of work. She never stuck with the same thing throughout her career. It's incredibly varied. She did kind of any kind of medium you can think of, she did it. She did plays and films, and she was, she could have been an actress very early on. She everything.
Wow. That's amazing.
Was her, sorry, I'm sorry. Was her very first work the shooting stuff, and then or had she done other?
The very first stuff she did was these. They were paintings, but they were figurative, and they were really like thick paint and almost kind of map-like. And then she went from there to doing reliefs, where she took, for instance, all these sharp objects like knives and axes, and she embedded them in the canvases. I actually really love those. They're super cool. And then she went, there were all of these works where she was embedding things. You can sort of see like the tear coming into focus. And then afterward, her next sort of big things that she did were the nanas. So everybody thinks like, oh, she did these beautiful celebrations of women, the nanas for the rest of her life, these buoyant women. But in fact, in between, she did these sculptures, these three-dimensional, almost life-size sculptures of women, and some of them were reliefs, and they're kind of frightening. And they're witches and brides and whores, and she put all of these like toys, like toy spiders and cars and all of these things embedded in their surface. And so there's this great transition between the shooting paintings and the nanas that come after, where these women who are really kind of frightening.
Are those anywhere that you can see them? No.
No. A lot of it is in Europe, which I
Okay.
think is part of the reason people don't hear them.
Right.
Women, it's hard for them to travel.
Right. Did you have a question, Karen? Oh, I thought you had. I was wondering if you have like favorite pieces in here, if you could just share a couple and talk about them.
I think my favorite is it's one toward the beginning. It's this giant piece of paper. It's probably about, I don't know, that big, I guess. And it's
What page is it?
It's 32. And it's got all of these letters of the alphabet, all these alphabets on one side and animals on the other, and it was sort of this, I don't know, it's such a revelation for me to see this in her archive. It ended up being in the PS1 show, but I saw it in the archive first, and it is almost like this missing link for me, because her work involves, so the work on paper in this book involves drawings and writing. And this is, the drawings look like the lettering and the lettering look like the drawings. And so it was like a code, like her own personal language, both in images and in words, where the drawing is writing and the writing is drawing. And that, to me, is just the crux of all of this work. And it's just so, it's also just so beautiful. I mean, she has such great handwriting. You'd see these letters where she would, you know, draw the letters of people's names, and they're just fantastic. And how they're just different forms of the letters here.
Yeah.
So that's hands down my favorite.
Okay. I love the one that's a letter to Laura, but it's I have it marked in that copy, but it's going around. But it's like it's like a letter saying, how am I going to do all of this stuff I have to do during the day? There it is, yeah. How can I in one day find enough time?
Oh dear Laura, yeah. And she signs them, they're hilarious.
Yeah.
She signs it Mary, so again, it's this sort of fake letter with a persona that she creates, but it's still dealing with things that she was thinking about. So it's, you know, how can I in one day find enough time? And it's like to play with the children at least 4 hours a day. I do most of the cooking. Helmut does some of it, but you should see the mess he leaves in the kitchen. Do exercise half an hour before breakfast. Breathe and meditate. Clean the house.
It's very
Iron,
relevant.
you know?
Yeah.
It's still relevant.
Wash my hair. It is.
Yeah.
She was this incredibly glamorous. She had been a model. She was on the cover of Vogue, but she also was a working artist.
Right.
There's that, you know, any woman who works and has a family, there's always that, like, there's never enough time to do all the things that you want to be or that people want to
Yeah.
And she has such a great sense of humor.
Yeah.
Was this her daughter that she was addressing?
Laura was her daughter, though, I mean, it wasn't an actual letter.
Uh-huh.
So sometimes she made up names, but this one is, there's no help, I'm like, Helmut was not a real person. Yeah, those letters are really good. She's funny, and
It's very playful, and
yeah.
you say, she said herself that no one was excluded from her work,
Yeah.
and I really love that. It's very accessible,
Yes,
her
it's
work.
very
It's
accessible.
not,
Yeah, and that was another, you know, part of my thinking is that there's nothing too difficult in here
Right.
that the reader won't
Right.
quite get. It might be a reference here and there, but really not much. And her
Mhm.
drawings are so easy to sort of make sense of.
Mhm.
But also, there's the sense that no one was excluded in that, you know, she wrote a book about AIDS because she had many friends who had AIDS, and one of her, you know, most beloved assistants died from it, and it, you know, it crushed her, and she was haunted by their deaths, and she wanted to do something about it. So she wrote the AIDS book in the 80s, and then they're not in here, but she made these prints very late in life. She died in 2002. She made one about abortion. She made one about guns in America. She made one about climate. So she was.
Yeah.
She made tons of things for children.
All of her work has this feel to it of children's literature,
Yeah.
you know?
She made playgrounds.
Yeah.
All over the place for children. And it's work that's meant to be, you know, so much of her work is work that's meant to be walked around and entered and climbed over. It's like the Han, this giant Nana that she made in '68 with Yves Tanguy and Per Olof Oltvedt in Sweden, that you entered through the vagina, and there was like all this stuff inside, like a slide, and a milk bar, and a movie theater, and big art.
That's cool.
And at the end, it was torn apart, but like
Yeah.
stuff that should be engaged with.
Right, right.
It was not meant to be just sort of looked at on the
Right.
wall. It was not meant to be exclusionary.
Right. I found the AIDS pieces, right? Is this what you were talking about?
Yeah.
The AIDS book?
Yeah, the excerpts from the AIDS book.
Yeah, so I'll pass that around.
She talks about being kind to people with AIDS, and this is at a time when people didn't really understand what it was. It was
Right.
very, people were very afraid, and she said, they're your friends,
Right.
hug
You
them.
can't get it from, it's like an instruction manual almost.
Yeah, and there's this picture that I love in that where she makes these condoms
Oh,
that she
yeah.
decorates in only the way that she could. They're giant, these colorful condoms.
And it says, wear a rubber.
Yeah, these
Use a
things.
rubber.
And then she made obelisks at some point afterward that look
Look like
exactly
that?
like this.
That's like a sketch.
I wonder if she was just like, these would make
These
great
obelisks.
obelisks.
Anyone have other questions? Yes.
I was wondering about kind of the back and forth you had in your head or with your publisher about calling it an autobiography versus a biography, and if there's any technicalities or legalities or pushback from lawyers.
No, thankfully, her estate, the foundation was, they were wonderful to work with. There's no word for it. And there are all of these wonderful hybrid books in existence that there aren't quite words for what they're doing. And so I wanted to sort of be upfront, like from the outset, about this was not, it was not a biography, it's also not an autobiography, it's both. So it was the only thing that I could sort of come up with to get that across. Maybe someone will invent a word for this other stuff. But it's both and neither at the same time.
Is this your first book, and are you working on a book?
It's my first, yes. I mean, I've edited things before that. I'm working on editing other ones. There will probably be something. I shouldn't say yet because it's too far away. And it's funny because I'm thinking about a biography, but it will be like much more traditional.
You can't talk about
It feels like jumping the gun.
I have a question. I mean, I find it so interesting that you discovered her work really young and that it stayed with you for so long. You know, a lot of times we discover something when we're young and then we kind of move on. So can you articulate, if it's possible, what were the qualities that you think like grabbed hold of you and like stayed with you? What were the qualities about the work that so spoke to you for so long?
I think it was definitely that she was French, because I really was obsessed. I think it was color, because I really, really love work that has a lot of color in it. I think too it was the fact that she was, that it was celebratory of women, which I think was not work that I saw a lot of. So I grew up in North Texas and went to, I went to a lot of, I saw a lot of art when I was a kid because my mom worked in Fort Worth and there were some great art museums there. And we would go to them frequently, but I don't think that I saw anything like her. And my mother worked, and she, I would listen to her and my father talk at the dinner table about, they were both professors, they taught at different schools, they were both cell biologists, and they would talk about their work, and my mother's experience was very different from my father's experience. And though I probably wasn't aware of all the details, like, you can sense that sort of stuff when you're a kid, and as I got older, I became, my awareness of it was heightened, and so I was always thinking about my mother's experience as a woman working, like,
Yes.
for most of my life, it's been in my mind, and when I graduated college and then went to graduate school and then, sort of entered the workforce, I, swore to myself, like, I was not gonna let the things that happened to my mother happen to me, right? But you can't, it did, right? You can't control it. But so there's this sort of, I think the feminist aspect of it that just really appealed to me. And it was always, if not explicitly with her work, just about life in general, that was always on my mind.
It's
Like
really
even when you're not
interesting.
thinking about it, it's
Yeah.
always there.
You felt it in her work that she was willing to be a renegade and
Yeah.
didn't care.
So then when I went back to it and started looking at it again, I could see it, I was much older and had a lot more sort of life experience. And I could see what was going on there. And the way that she was dealing with, problems, anxieties, and doubt her entire life. There's, the last thing that I found for the book was this diary called A Drug Journey that I didn't get to see when I was at her archive, and I got them to send it to me, and it was these diary entries she made in 1995 that nobody had seen, that nobody had published. And they were, 7 years before she died. And she's talking about trying out different medications because she had all these health issues, particularly later in life, which is why she ended up in California. But she's still talking about doubting herself and doubting her abilities. And when Jean dies and she's given control of his estate, like all these people descend, and she's like, what am I gonna do? And feeling like she can't manage it. So like these are never problems that you get rid of. They're there forever, which is why I think her work is so partly fascinating, because she dealt with them and explored them in all these different ways.
I love that, thank you.
Anyone else? The art
Professor?
historian.
The art professor?
I know, what is it?
Like, come on. And it better be good.
Think about it.
Okay, so as Nicole knows already, I'm friends with Niki de Saint Phalle's daughter-in-law. She's a colleague of mine, she's an art historian. And so when I told her about this book, she immediately, her first reaction was like, oh, another biography. But then I sent her what you were doing, and she thought it was really interesting that allowing Niki's voice to come through instead of the way we, of course, biographers and art historians are by default biographers in general, we're always interpreting on behalf of someone, even who, if they're alive, especially those who are dead, because we have more control. But she thought this was just, it was a very short exchange, but she was really interested, and this was when you first told us you were working on it, so I don't know what her response is to after it's been published, but she liked that idea that there was trying, like you said earlier, trying to find that happy medium of not being too overbearing with our own analysis or your own analysis, and letting her voice come through, but also creating some sort of management control so there's a narrative that comes through.
Yeah.
And I was really struck by the fact, as an art historian, and I have to teach, even in a modern art class, it's still a survey, and it's lined up with the canon of art history. And my job is to constantly try to be breaking through that canon. And so we bring in, or I try to bring in artists like Niki de Saint Phalle and Florian Stettheimer, and it's interesting that the students really respond to the renegade artists. They really understand what it is to be kind of working against the tide that they're being kind of pulled along with, that the students, as in society, doing everything they should, and then seeing how these artists, mostly women and people of color, are kind of trying to work outside of this, inserting themselves in it, but also in a very calculated, a very deliberate way. And I think the challenge of teaching someone like, or any artist really, but especially Niki de Saint Phalle, is, I want to say, oh, let's look at the shooting pieces because she's doing this and this and this, and saying F you to these abstract expressionists. But then I'm like, oh, but then she does these nanas, which are really amazing, and then she does these whimsical pieces, and there's the tarot garden, and then, the hour and a half is gone, and I haven't talked about anybody else. And so I think I appreciate that challenge of how to write autobiography and be able to touch these various aspects of her life that are so incredibly important and are different Nikis.
Yeah,
As
Yeah.
you said, we're all different people, and as women, we all know that we're, the mom, we're the this, we're the that, but artists are different, and authors are different points in their careers too, and how do we pick what is the exemplary moment of their
yeah.
productive
I don't know,
productive
I
life?
don't envy you that, I guess. But it's hard for, like, Stettheimer and,
That wasn't a question.
Why did I sit by
Corey?
they don't fit into any category.
They don't,
You
and-
can't teach them when you're teaching something else, because they really do stand alone.
And when we teach, I mean.
And I think there are a lot of writers and artists that are like that fell by the wayside for one reason or another. Capitalism, like you can't sell the work, and so people stop talking about it.
And also some of the artists we do talk about is because they were promoted, we found out later, not only by the critics, but the critics were actually selling and buying their works. So by promoting, like Clement Greenberg and all these artists who were writing about these, or critics who were writing about these artists, were doing so because they were then driving up the sales, which then put those artists within the canon. So it becomes this messy.
It's publishing today too.
Yeah.
I mean,
Is it?
it's the
Yeah.
same sort of thing.
And I think when we teach Niki de Saint Phalle, she tends to come in as someone who's working against ABEX. So then, she's the outlier there too. Like we still have the canon marching along with these dudes, New York school, and then, she comes in and kind of disrupts it a little bit, then comes out, and Helen Frankenthaler comes in and disrupts it a little bit, after Pollock, and then, so they're these little blips, but they're still blips. They're not the.
But they're not actually disrupting it. Like that's not.
Well, that's what I mean, like they're
Yeah.
not actually, we try to
That's
pull them
not
in, but they're
what's-
not.
That's not what is motivating them to create the art, right?
Mm-hmm.
It just so happens that ABEX is dominant, and so they're doing something else or something slightly different.
Yeah. And ABEX they're not even really a school, we made that up.
Yeah.
So-
The whole problem with movements is that they're incredibly diverse in their
It also seems like it's so hard to, her work can't be just put on a couple slides. Like the tarot card just popped up in my Instagram feed the other day.
Really?
Yeah. And
How? Why?
Well, just somebody I know went there.
Oh, okay.
And it's like, it's amazing. I mean, it's an amazing place. So it's like hard to do that and the shooting stuff and, it's all such a different work.
It's very different.
Yeah. They should have anti-canon classes, sorry.
Sure they do. They must. They must.
Yeah. That's what you do in grad school. You take
Yeah,
a class on
right.
the history of whatever, and then your teacher says, okay, how would you
Take
write
it
this
apart.
history? And you're like, I don't know.
Well, thank you so much,
Thank you,
Nicole,
Laura.
for this
Yeah.
wonderful. Nicole has copies of the book for sale, so please see her if you'd like a copy of this gorgeous book. We do have a copy here at the library, so you can check it out, but you should buy it. And thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Thank
you. Yeah.
Really